Hi, and welcome to Logic and Computational Thinking. If you haven't gone through the course yet, I'm really excited for you to jump into the material. And before you get started in that material, I wanted to spend some time here with Dr. Paul Herrick. Thank you for joining us today, Paul.
Thank you, Paul.
Dr. Herrick's book is the book called Think with Socrates, and it's a lot of the content that you're going to experience in the course actually comes from Paul's book. So I thought it would be a lot of fun to spend a few minutes just chatting with Paul. He's had a long career teaching logic. He's written a couple of textbooks, and so I thought it would be good to get some background. Logic can be a little stodgy for some people and seem very academic, so I thought it would give a little bit of a human face to talk about what goes into logic. So again, we're going to talk a little bit about this book in a minute.
Okay.
I want to talk a little bit about your career. So you graduated from the University of Washington. I don't want to maybe date you here, but how long ago?
Quite a few years ago.
Okay, quite a few, good.
Yeah.
So you have your PhD in philosophy, and you've taught philosophy and logic now for how many years?
35 years.
Wow, you're on your 35th year. That's amazing.
Yeah.
So Paul and I have been friends for a decade and a half, just about.
Well, I met you 18 years ago.
Okay, yes, so just about. And
at a philosopher's talk.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember exactly where we were. And so we've been talking logic and philosophy for those 18 years. You have two texts published, logic texts, one with Harcourt Brace. It was called The Many Worlds of Logic, which was a great book. I used that in many of the courses that I taught. And now you have a new logic text out with Oxford University Press, which is no small feat. Oxford University Press is probably the premier publisher of philosophy. So it's quite an accomplishment to get that book published. So let's talk about both those logic texts. I would, as I look through textbooks like the ones that you've written, I just can see an enormous amount of work there. Why did you write your first logic book, your logic text with Harcourt Brace?
Well, I taught logic for 10 or 12 years with various textbooks. And they were wonderful books, but every book I used, there were features of logic I wanted to include that the book didn't include. And the textbooks that I used didn't explain things as thoroughly as I wanted to explain them. And a lot of students these days are so busy that they'll attend class just a few times a week. And I wanted a textbook that explained everything more thoroughly so that a student could learn it at home and not have to come to class every day. And I wanted the textbook to include certain topics that weren't in the books I was using. So I began writing my own, and I spent 5 years trying to incorporate modal logic into the introductory logic textbook. I thought this was an important branch of logic that isn't covered very often.
Why don't we take a quick tangent? We don't cover modal logic in this course. Can you just briefly explain what modal logic is?
So modal logic is the logic of possibility and necessity. And it turns out that a lot of the great philosophical arguments employ modal logic in their reasoning. So it's a fascinating branch of logic. It actually goes back to the beginning of the discipline. Aristotle, the founder of logic, is also the founder of modal logic. But in this branch of logic, philosophers study necessity and possibility with respect to propositions. So propositions can be necessarily true or necessarily false, possibly true, possibly false. With respect to properties, so an entity can possess a property necessarily or contingently. And with respect to existence, which is the most controversial part of modal logic. But modal logicians believe that some things can exist necessarily and other things can exist on a contingent basis. And so that's part of modal logic. So I wanted to incorporate modal logic into the introductory course. And I wanted to explain things more thoroughly than usual. And that's what led me to write my first book. And I developed a passion for putting everything into a system. It was exciting to try to get all the right elements in all the right places in a systematic form that would flow and that students would follow. And so that was exciting for me.
Is that where the title Many Worlds came from?
Well,
you had these different systems that
actually, Many Worlds of Logic was an allusion to modal logic.
Oh, I see, okay.
And I don't know if I should go into why it was, but modal logicians refer to things they call possible worlds. And the semantics of modal logic is all defined in terms of theoretical entities called possible worlds, ways the universe could have been or could be. And so it was an allusion to that. So very interesting aspect of modal logic.
Yeah, for sure. So that was a big distinguishing factor of your book relative to other
Well,
logic
that's,
books.
I think, why it was published, because it integrated modal logic into the standard logic course. And as far as I know, only one other book did that.
Yeah.
And so it was exciting because I could bring in arguments about free will and about time and fatalism, whether the future's already been fated to happen, into the logic course and develop those arguments using the symbols of modal logic, and that was kind of fun.
Sure.
Yep.
So how do you do research for a book like this? One of the questions, I actually have never asked you this personally, so I can ask you now on camera. When you're preparing to write a book like on logic or even mathematics or something like that, it's been done for so many decades and centuries. How do you approach it uniquely? Like when you're writing your examples or you're writing the definition of a modus ponens or a modus tollens, a lot of the definitions that we use in this course are definitions I pulled from your book and other logic textbooks, and I couldn't really reword them that much because it's a definition, right? A modus ponens is what a modus ponens is. So how do you approach the topic so that you're giving it your own voice and writing it in your way and not just copying what someone else has done?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've always walked into the classroom without notes. I've never taken notes into the classroom. I prepare ahead of time, but when I walk into the classroom, I am explaining things to students as clearly as I can at the moment, spontaneously. And then what works in the classroom is what goes into my textbook. So for many years, I taught logic 3 times a day. And I got a lot of feedback from students, and I used that to try to explain things as clearly as I could.
Sure.
And as I'm writing the book, I'm thinking back on my classroom experiences, what explanations work best, and what parts of logic connect with students, and what parts aren't really necessary, because you really have to be selective when you write a textbook.
Yeah,
Every
for sure.
textbook, no textbook can cover everything.
Right.
Yeah.
So talk about your book with Oxford University Press. That's a very different book from Many Worlds in some ways. I mean, there's obviously some overlap. What were you going after there?
Well, the third logic book I wrote was a complete revision of the previous 2. And I revised it from the ground up, and Oxford had it reviewed by a number of teachers and liked it and published it. It's actually more, I actually went further on explaining everything. It ended up 800 pages, but I tried to explain things so thoroughly that a student could be at home studying and would find complete explanations of everything all the way through. And so it's even more explained, I think, than the first 2 books. The second logic book I wrote expanded the coverage into a lot of inductive logic that wasn't in the first book. The first book was almost all deductive logic.
Sure.
The second book brought a lot of inductive logic in. And then the third logic book, the one you're mentioning now, called Introduction to Logic, has everything from the previous 2, but I just went through from the ground up and re-explained everything. It was really fun to try to clarify even further everything I had tried to say. And I added some more sections that I hadn't covered.
That's great. And I like Introduction to Logic because of that, the latest book with Oxford University Press. And in fact, throughout the course, if the topics that you're studying and that you're reading through interest you, I highly recommend you take a look at getting Dr. Herrick's Logic textbook. This book is more of an introduction to critical thinking, the one that we've been using in this course. But Dr. Herrick's textbooks definitely go into more depth in the formal logic spaces. And you can, I think there's an ebook, correct, for the Oxford University Press, so you can get a digital version if you want.
Yeah, both books have a e-text version. Yeah.
And they're relatively inexpensive as textbooks go. A lot of textbooks are in the couple $100 range. These are what, 50 to 60 or something like that?
Yeah, around 60. Oxford.
That's a good price.
Oxford is a nonprofit publisher,
Right.
and they produce quality books at quite a bit less than the big commercial publishers.
Yeah.
And
that's why I don't feel bad recommending these books to you. They're great texts. One of the things about this latest book is that you can study from it on your own. So if you get the good foundation in this course, Logic and Computational Thinking, then you can expand your studies by taking Dr. Herrick's book and working through it on your own. I think you can get a lot of value there. So let's talk a little bit about Think with Socrates. Okay. Think with Socrates is a really fun book. I really enjoyed reading through it. It covers a lot of topics very nicely, which is why I wanted to use the book in this course. We licensed a lot of the content from Oxford University Press, and a lot of the content that's in the book you'll find directly in the course. There's other things that are not in the course itself, so if you want to go and do more study, the book is a nice option there. But what gave you the idea to come up with the book Think with Socrates, and what was your goals in producing that?
Well, alongside symbolic logic, I've always taught critical thinking. And critical thinking is a different course. Although it's hard sometimes to distinguish logic and critical thinking. But the critical thinking course is logic applied to everyday life. That's one way to think of it. Mm-hmm. So critical thinking literally means criterial thinking, or thinking by criteria. So criteria are standards of evaluation. And critical thinking literally is thinking by standards of good thinking. And critical thinking courses are generally pitched towards improving the reasoning abilities we use in everyday life to make them more realistic and more effective. So I always taught critical thinking, and Socrates always came up because he's generally considered the founder of critical thinking. He was the very first philosopher to teach critical thinking as a means of improving your life, and to give his life for teaching it, because the Athenian democracy executed him primarily because of the critical thinking he was teaching the citizens. And so he's considered the founder, but most critical thinking books, they honor Socrates, they mention him, but they don't build the course around him. And students, when they meet Socrates, they fall in love with him. Mm-hmm. He's a remarkable human being, a remarkable character. He's so inspiring. And I fell in love with Socrates, and the idea came to me to build a critical thinking course around his persona. That was sort of what led me to write the book. The book attempts, introduces students to Socrates, his person, his life, his method of thought, and then the whole rest of the book builds on that and refers back to him. And so the course is built around a person, but a remarkable person, a person who sometime in the middle of his life realized that a lot of people think they know what they're talking about when they haven't a clue. They think they're an expert in things, and they really have no idea what they're talking about. Mm-hmm. And he could have just grabbed people by the collar and shook them. He could have been angry, but he had so much respect for the individual and so much love of his fellow human beings that he couldn't be harsh with people and yell at them and shake them. His method turned out to be different. He asked people questions, but they were questions designed to cause people to look in the mirror and examine their own assumptions and find out for themselves where they were going wrong.
Right. And that's become known as the Socratic method.
That is the Socratic method. Looking, I would put it this way, looking in the mirror and evaluating your assumptions and your actions on the basis of realistic criteria related to truth and justice. And he gave his life for that vision, the vision of a life in which a person constantly examines his assumptions, is willing to admit he's wrong, is willing to correct his actions and his views. And so that became known as critical thinking. And so I wanted to organize the book around that human vision, really.
Yeah, it really turned out to be a great result. You know, when we think about logic and computational thinking and applying logical principles to writing computer programs, there's a direct relationship between the formal logic, the deductive reasoning, the inductive reasoning, the categorical reasoning that we talk about in the course. But there's a whole aspect of working with other people and, you know, working in a business or a corporation or selling your work that takes those logical concepts and applies them to life. And I think that we try to bring out some of those topics as well in the course, and you certainly do a great job of relating kind of logic to real life, right? Logic can be fairly academic and a little bit stodgy sometimes, but you do a really good job of showing, no, you know, there's a huge practical side to this discipline, and taking those concepts and applying them to real problems. Yeah.
Well, once you're aware of the nature of critical thinking, you're looking at the criteria. And if you're in an organization and decisions are being made and you're part of the decision-making process, you can look at the criteria that are being used and you can ask, are these criteria appropriate for the goal, for our goal? Are these criteria grounded in reality? Are these criteria realistic? You can ask questions like that. That's what a critical thinker does. And so once you're aware of the way critical thinking works, it can be a tool that you use in an organization, in a group, as well as just in your own personal life.
For sure.
So.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thanks, Paul. It was really nice to hear a little bit about the textbooks, and then of course about Think with Socrates, which has been a fantastic asset to our course. What we'll do in the next video is talk a little bit about how logic can be applied to real-world problems. We'll talk a little bit about some of the challenges that students face when they just first start studying logic, and we'll explore those topics a little bit in the next video. We'll see you there.
Thank you.